today is the anniversary of the Battle of Veerkop back in 16th of October 1836, when Paul Kruger, at age 11, fought his first battle as one of the 40 men at the Battle of Veerkop. But we dealt with that at our Friday Kruger 200 on the 10th, just last week. So I'm focusing on an anniversary that's coming next week. Next week, on the 21st of October, will be the 220th anniversary of the Battle of Trafalgar. Now, Admiral Horatio Nelson and the Battle of Trafalgar are major events and character in history, and I think well worthy of our attention. So there was a phenomenal naval victory, one of the greatest naval victories in all of history, at Trafalgar 220 years ago. The Battle of Trafalgar, fought on the 21st of October, 1805, was one of the most important decisive naval engagements of all time, decisively establishing the supremacy of the Royal Navy on the high seas. And rather than a conventional engagement between lines of battle with gunnery duels between lines of ships on both sides, the English made a bold attack that allowed them to gain a local superiority, to use their term, over the enemy, and to rake their ships with devastating broadsides. The French and Spanish fleets were decisively defeated, and British supremacy on the high seas was decisively established for the rest of the 19th century. And this is one of the reasons why in Cape Town we have a Mount Nelson Hotel. Admiral Nelson's defeat of the French and Spanish fleets at Trafalgar allowed British trade to flourish around the world, even as far as the Cape, where we are, laying foundations for Britain's emergence as an economic superpower. The war between Great Britain and France was a clash between a great naval power, Britain, and a great land power, France. There was a time when France defined the military. They were considered the greatest military force in the world, which is why even the Americans in the war between the states modeled their hats, their uniforms, even their tactics on the French, because Napoleon and the French were considered, they were the greatest example of what an army should be. And so people were copying the French very much at that time, much like people would try and copy the British Royal Navy when it came to naval matters. But in the same year that Emperor Napoleon of France won his greatest land victory at the Battle of Austerlitz, his plan to invade the British Isles was destroyed by the victory of Admiral Nelson at the Battle of Trafalgar off the coast of Spain. After the defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588 under Queen Elizabeth I, England emerged as the greatest of the world's maritime powers. Before that time, it was Spain and Portugal. They were the greatest world powers. They dominated the seas, the lands, and everything, which is one reason why Protestant missions were impossible in the 16th century. Not that they didn't try, but even the missionaries sent out from Geneva by John Calvin from the academy, the missionaries he sent to Brazil were all discovered and executed within weeks of landing. So that was the way it was when the Catholics dominate the seas. Protestant missionaries overseas was just impossible, not that they didn't try. But this victory over the Spanish Armada in 1588 permitted vast mercantile interest in every corner of the world by the Protestants, which became the Netherlands, and Britain had the greatest navies in the world on the Protestant side. As an island nation, since the time of King Alfred the Great, England relied on her navy for protection. But England always had relatively small land forces, especially compared to France, who could muster millions of men ultimately. While Britain's standing army was quite small, a large navy was always maintained. Britain would spend more on its navy than it would on its army, always. But even when you deal with the First World War, Britain was spending more on its navy than its army and its air force combined. And the Royal Navy honed its ship handling and its gunnery skills, and they maintained a very high standard of seamanship by constant experience. And at the outbreak of war with revolutionary France, the Royal Navy was operating at a high degree of efficiency. In fact, we could say they were at their peak. The Royal Navy was absolutely cutting edge. They could fire the fastest, the most accurately, the best. Their seamanship was unparalleled, unrivaled anywhere in the world. However, the French fleet had been drastically weakened by a purge of its officers during the French Revolution. Many of France's most experienced seamen and gunners had been dismissed from the service because they were aristocrats. Many had been sent to the guillotine because they were of the wrong class. That's not the way to build up your navy. With the Royal Navy blockading the French ports, the French Navy deteriorated even further because they had inexperienced crews who spend most of the time holed up in port, are probably more effective at getting drunk than at seamanship or anything else. However, to defeat Britain, a land invasion was necessary. And before the French could consider invading the British Isles, the Royal Navy would need to be drastically reduced. Now, reduced is a military term meaning destroyed. So when they speak about we need to reduce the enemy, they mean kill enough of them that they're no longer able to be a threat. But it sounds nicer to speak about reduced. The Emperor Napoleon ordered his Admiral Pierre Villeneuve to command the French fleet and to unite the squadrons at Toulon in the Mediterranean and Brest on the Atlantic with the Spanish fleet in the West Indies and the Spanish fleet that's in Cadiz. The problem with Admiral Pierre Villeneuve is he had gotten thoroughly thrashed at the Battle of the Nile by Lord Admiral Nelson, which meant he wasn't too keen to have a rematch. With this concentration of forces, bring the French Mediterranean fleet, the French Atlantic fleet, and the Spanish fleet together, Napoleon hoped he could overwhelm the Royal Navy. They might be better, but we are more. And this would open the way for land invasion across the Channel. So he thought. And Villeneuve commanded an impressive fleet in terms of gunpowder and in the number of first-rate ships. The French and Spanish combined fleets had more line of battleships. That means what we would call today battleships, the first line with the thickest hulls and the most guns and all that. Much more than a British fleet. Some of the most powerful warships in the world were under French command. In fact, even in the Second World War, do you know, France had the biggest submarines in the world, not that they were ever used. They had the most submarines, they had the biggest, much more than the Kriegsmarine of the Germans. They had bigger battleships even than the British, but they didn't use them, so not much good. And most of them got sunk by the British, their allies, because the British were afraid that maybe Germany would try to get hold of the French fleet. In the summer of 1805, Emperor Napoleon was encamped with his grand army at Boulogne, ready to invade Britain. Going to be a long wait. Napoleon required the French Navy and its Spanish allies to destroy the Royal Navy to enable his invasion force to cross the Channel. Once they got underwater, they'd be easy pickings for the Royal Navy, so you've got to reduce the Royal Navy first. The French Mediterranean fleet under Vice Admiral Pierre-Charles Villeneuve was to join up with the Spanish fleet under Admiral Federico Gravina and enable the French Atlantic Squadron to break out of the British blockade at Brest. When Villeneuve took refuge at Cadiz in Spain, Napoleon ordered him relieved of command. Hoping to redeem his honor, Villeneuve decided to sail before his replacement arrived. So on the 19th of October, 33 French and Spanish ships of the line began to leave Cadiz. Cadiz, you might recall, was a key part of the Spanish Armada. At one point, Sir Francis Drake raided the port of Cadiz and burned a lot of the Spanish fleet there, delaying the Spanish Armada, what they called singeing the beard of the King of Spain. So the French and Spanish sailed for the Straits of Gibraltar with Admiral Nelson's blockade force in pursuit. William Cornwallis had maintained a tight blockade off Brest with a Channel fleet. But Lord Nelson adopted a loose blockade in the hope of luring the French out for a major battle. He didn't have his people right there just outside the port, preventing them to get out. He wanted them to come out. And so Nelson used frigates, which are lighter, faster, but not robust enough for line of battle. A frigate couldn't go up against a line of battle, first-line battleship. It didn't have enough guns, and its hull wasn't thick enough. So to keep constant watch on the harbor, the frigates were the scouts, but the main force remained out of sight about 50 miles west of the shore. Well, the French and the Spanish fleets outnumbered the Royal Navy. The French crews included very few experienced sailors, to put it nicely. At the Battle of Trafalgar, Nelson was outnumbered and he was outgunned. with the enemy totaling nearly 30,000 men with over 2,500 guns, and Nelson only had 17,000 men and 2,100 guns, which goes to show that numbers aren't the decisive matter. When it comes down to it, skill, speed, and surprise actually still counts for more. Just think of Gideon's 300. Sometimes a smaller group can win. Although the fleet under the command of Lord Nelson were outnumbered and outgunned, there's no doubt the British sailors were far better trained and far more disciplined than the French revolutionary rabble. So who was Horatio Nelson, Britain's most famous seaman? Lord Nelson's father was a minister of the gospel of the Church of All Saints in Burnham Thorpe, and his father, Reverend Edmund Nelson, was rector of the parish from 1755 to 1802. Inside the church today, there's many displays and items of interest regarding Nelson's life and family. Here's All Saints Church in Burnham, and a magnificent church. And the birthplace of Admiral Lord Nelson is not far away, but unfortunately they have pulled it down in 1803. You can't see where he was born, but you can see the barn where he worked. That is still standing. The All Saints Church flies the 18th century white ensign of the Royal Navy in memory of Admiral Lord Nelson, who was christened there by his father. That's a St. George's cross with the Union Jack in the left-hand corner, which seems to be banned in Britain these days. I mean, people have actually been arrested for flying the flag of England in England. I mean, how terrible to fly your own country's flag, because it caused offense to some of the Muslims to say the St. Andrew's cross is a Crusader flag, which is exactly what it is, yes. It's Richard the Lionheart's flag. Now, Horatio Nelson was enlisted in the Royal Navy at age 12. Now, you could imagine if his mother had been alive, she wouldn't have approved, but his mother wasn't around to protect him, and that's what his father approved of. Maybe he was being quite a naughty boy, but shipping your kids off to the Navy, young as that, was a pretty rough way of dealing with the problems. Later, when Admiral Nelson came across some gunnery boy and asked his age, and he said 12, and he said, too young, too young. So he must have known from personal experience. It must have been a pretty brutal introduction to life. He served aboard the Caracas at age 15, on expedition to the Arctic Sea, which must have been very, very hard. By 18, he was a lieutenant, and at age 20, he was given command of a frigate, the Hinchinbrook. Nelson became the youngest captain of the Royal Navy, aged 20, in 1779. I think they grew up a lot faster than him. The 28-gun frigate Boreas, which was captained by Horatio Nelson in 1787. Nelson saw service in the Caribbean during the American Revolutionary War, when the Americans were revolting against their British leaders, and he rose swiftly in the ranks. I think one of the reasons he rose swiftly in the ranks is so many of the captains who might have led from the front died in battle, and so the younger ones were being promoted a lot quicker. In war, you can rise in the ranks rapidly through what they call attrition. Military's got lots of lovely terms like that, attrition, reducing. He married Fanny Nisbet, a doctor's widow, on 11th of March in 1787, at the end of his tour of duty in the Caribbean. And in 1794, Nelson was shot in the face during an engagement at Calvi on Corsica, and he lost the sight of his right eye. It was a piece of shrapnel, and while he didn't have to wear a patch over his eye, because the eye was not so disfigured, but it damaged the cornea. And his response to his wife was, "Don't worry, I've got another eye." His remaining eye was also damaged, and he was slowly going blind in the years leading up to his death. He first won renown for his initiative at the Battle of Cape St. Vincent, 1797, against French revolutionary forces, which was a brutal battle. Here's Nelson receiving the swords of the Spanish, surrendering to the Battle of Cape St. Vincent, 1797. You can see some people praying in the background, and obviously a more gracious age. They would have been saluting, bowing, taking off of hats, and handing over of swords, the ceremonies, and there was respect given to both sides, and the surrendering generals or captains, in this case, were treated more honorably than I think you could expect these days. It's a brutal thing to be a prisoner of war these days, but I think there was still some honor, and you can see this officer raising his hat to the enemy, and there would have been respect given to a defeated enemy. Nelson became a rear admiral in 1797, following intense fighting on the Canary Islands, the Battle of Santa Cruz de Tenerife. He lost his right arm, and that was a brutal battle, and he had the amputation without any form of anesthetic. And it was, he always throughout his life afterwards insisted that the surgeons must, call them surgeons, that's a nice term, must heat their knives before they attempted amputations, because he had a cold knife and he was being held down, but there was no pain-killing whatsoever. And so he remembered that the rest of his life, he only had a few inches left of his right arm. Yeah, it was right arm cut off. And he called it his flipper. It was just a little, or fin. It was his fin. And not having a right arm, he was convinced that his work was finished, because no one in the Navy wants a armless man who's missing an eye. And his stunning victory at the Battle of the Nile in 1798 against Napoleon's expeditionary force made Nelson a national hero. And he was a model of courage. He managed to divide his forces. The French fleet was in a very strong position with their backs against the land and able to put all their attention on the seaward side. But Nelson managed to get 4 of his ships on the landward side. There was just enough space and enough depth that he could get 4 ships behind him. He brought the rest of his fleet in front, and he basically, like a nutcracker, crushed the French fleet. And this was under the command of Villeneuve, who later got smashed at Trafalgar. He must have really misliked Nelson by that stage. And Nelson had a tendency to disobey orders. At the Battle of the Nile, he actually charged, pistol in one hand, or musket we should say, and sword in the other, charging across into enemy ships, leading. Now, as a young lieutenant, it was expected that you'd lead attacks, but it wasn't expected of admirals. And he, even when he was older, he was leading attacks, and which is why his whole body was missing so many limbs and all that sort of thing. Well, you've heard of turning a blind eye to something. Well, that comes from the Battle of Copenhagen in 1801, when he put the telescope to his blind eye, when his commanding officer instructed him to disengage from the enemy. And so he was able to put the telescope to his blind eye and say, no, I didn't see any orders about disengaging.
I'll see no ships.
Yeah. So Admiral Horatio Nelson's famous Battle of Copenhagen on 2nd of April 1801 was a clear inspiration for the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941. Although Denmark was officially neutral during the Napoleonic Wars, Britain feared that the Danish Navy might be seized by the French if Denmark fell to the French, which it didn't. So the Battle of Copenhagen was a result of multiple failures of diplomacy, to put it nicely. While Britain enforced a strict blockade of France, they also enforced a strict blockade on any country trading with France. Even neutral nations like Denmark, Sweden, Prussia were regarded as legitimate targets by the Royal Navy. Admiral Sir Hyde Parker and Vice Admiral Horatio Nelson led the attack on the Danish capital of Copenhagen. And the Danish, of course, were once a great seafaring people. They were amongst the Vikings. And the Danes at one time ruled England, actually, under King Canute, for example. The British attack, during which Admiral Nelson famously placed his telescope to his blind eye, ignoring a command to withdraw, was, from the British perspective, spectacularly successful. 1,600 Danish soldiers and sailors were killed or wounded. Most of the Danish Navy were either sunk, severely damaged, or even captured. And although ostensibly neutral, Denmark was again attacked by the Royal Navy between the 16th of August and the 5th of December in 1807, with the Royal Navy bombarding the capital city of Copenhagen and seizing the Danish fleet as a precaution in case Denmark did choose to join the French. So, bearing in mind that they could literally shell the capital city of a neutral country. 3,000 civilians and soldiers, including 195 children in Copenhagen, died as a result of the British bombardment and left a lot of wreckage behind. So as the majority of the Danish army was on the southern border to protect against a possible attack from the French, this second assault on a neutral country was a great scandal at that time. Knowing the Imperial Japanese Navy was modeled on the British Royal Navy, these famous battles, these strategies, these tactics of Copenhagening the fleet, which is part of British naval doctrine, of even a neutral country where a potential threat was perceived, including Britain's French allies. In 1940, the British sank the French fleet at anchor. And most tellingly at the Battle of Toronto, where aircraft using torpedoes launched from an aircraft carrier crippled the Italian battle fleet. All of this should have been taken into consideration by the US Navy in 1941. I mean, history can teach you no end of lessons. And here's a textbook on how the Japanese and the Royal Navy were old enemies and were old friends and new enemies. You can see that the naval officers of Japan were modeled totally on the British Royal Navy. And in fact, looking at a Japanese naval portrait in 1941, it looks very much like the Royal Navy. They were obviously modeling the uniforms, their tactics, everything they did in the Japanese Imperial Navy was modeled on the British Royal Navy. During the Battle of the Nile in 1798, Nelson's HMS captain became so mauled as to be incapable of further service. And therefore, Nelson plowed his ship into the starboard quarter of the San Nicolas, and leading a boarding party onto the ship, sword in hand, the San Jose had entangled itself with the San Nicolas, which was on fire. And with the battle cry of Westminster Abbey or glorious victory, which is sort of like the Vikings, Valhalla or victory. So he led his men across the burning San Nicolas to seize the San Jose. And so his HMS captain captured the San Nicolas and the San Jose by plowing into them. And Nelson's men secured both ships. This move was afterwards called Nelson's patented bridge for boarding first rates. In other words, you make your ship a bridge, plow into the enemy, and then you seize other ships, and your ship is no longer workable. Imagine you crashing your car into another car because your car is now got too many things that need replacing, and now you're hijacking 2 more cars as a result. Nelson receiving the surrender of the San Jose. I mean, again, you can see here's the chaplain in the background giving thanks for the victory, and you can see the gallantry and the chivalry on both sides, both the defeated and the victors. And the Battle of the Nile, here's the burning of the L'Orient, which is one of the biggest ships in the world at that time. 1798 at the Battle of the Nile, you can see this French ship going up in flames. In fact, the whole thing exploded at one point. And the sailors at a Thanksgiving service on board Lord Nelson's ship at the Battle of the Nile. Again, you can see the prayer book, you can see the kneeling, you can see the reverence, and the thanksgiving to God. There were successive naval victories, and this caused Nelson to be promoted to Vice Admiral, Commander-in-Chief of the Mediterranean Fleet by 1803. His flagship, the HMS Victory, was constructed from more than 6,000 trees, mostly oak. By the way, the oak is not indigenous to Britain. Do you know that the oak trees were brought to Britain by the Romans? So these imbeciles who have been deforesting the Cape are saying these trees are not indigenous to the Cape. Well, you know that mealie meal is not indigenous to Africa, it's American corn. Rubber is not indigenous to Malaya. Coffee is not indigenous to anywhere except Ethiopia. All the coffee in the whole world comes from Ethiopia. And so if people don't like some trees because they're not indigenous, well, imagine you'd have to take sugar cane away from KwaZulu-Natal, you'd have to take mealie meal away from Africa. It's just insane, this idea that if a tree's not indigenous, we should deforest the place. Well, who can imagine Britain without oak trees? But oak trees are not indigenous to Britain. So HMS Victory cost £63,000 to build, which today would be 60 million British pounds today. This was a phenomenal outlay, and HMS Victory still exists, by the way. It's the oldest ship still in commission of the Royal Navy. And you can actually visit it. It's in port, and you can go to Plymouth and board the ship and see exactly what it looked like. Victory was operated by a crew of 850 men, with 104 mounted smoothbore muzzle loading cannon. Now, just to give you a perspective, Admiral Nelson had on the Victory more cannon than Napoleon at the Battle of Austerlitz, which was his biggest victory. So the firepower of these ships, this is what they call line of battle ship, with three levels or stories of cannon. You could just imagine the devastating punch that this kind of battleship had. They had 26 miles of rope used to rig the Victory, along with 768 blocks or pulleys for the sails. Victory had 7 anchors, the heaviest weighed more than 4.5 tons. Can you imagine anchors like that? And by the way, a sailor will tell you, don't get between the rope of the anchor and any portion of the ship, because you can lose your legs. I mean, the weight, when that anchor goes down and you're standing in the way, the rope can literally sever a limb if you get pinned against one of the sides. So HMS Victory is a phenomenal example of British seamanship, just an example of why they had the greatest navy in the world for so many years. Operating these 32-pounders aboard HMS Victory required a very high degree of efficient teamwork to maintain a fast rate of fire. If you've been down to the Castle of Good Hope, you'd see they've got, the biggest there would be 18-pounders. They've got 8-pounders, they've got 12-pounders, and then the 18-pounder was considered too big to have on a ship. And therefore, when a ship was coming in towards Cape Town, our 18-pounders could hit any invading ship before the ship could be able to be opening fire on the castle. And that's a key part, that this is the benefit of forts. Forts can have bigger cannon. So to have been able to put 32-pounders, and when we say 32-pounders, that's the weight of the shot, the cannonball in this case. Now, my father in the Second World War, he operated a 25-pounder, which was the best weapon Britain had in artillery for the 6 years of the Second World War. And that was the most effective anti-tank weapon that they had, a 25-pounder. But a 32-pounder, I mean, that's just phenomenal. And these cannon, you've heard about the term loose cannon. He's a loose cannon. That comes from the Navy. You see, all these ships' cannon, you see how they're tied up with ropes. Because when they fired, the recoil is huge. And so you need the ropes to arrest it so that it doesn't plow down across a lot of people, smash to the other side of the ship and cause havoc. So if you don't tie down your cannon, and your cannon becomes a loose cannon after it's fired, well, it's a threat to life and limb. It's even a threat to the ship itself. So a person who's a loose cannon, this is a naval term. By the way, another English term, letting the cat out of the bag. You know what that means? The cat that they're referring to is not a feline. It's the cat of 9 tails. They've got 9 leather straps on. So when you let the cat out of the bag, it means there's trouble. Somebody's going to get really hurt. Naval term. Well, he's let the cat out of the bag. Maybe he reported somebody's action or ratted on some colleague, but he's let the cat out of the bag. This person's going to get flogged. So there's some interesting terms from the military. Now, each gunner had a specific task which had to be carried out in the right order. In the right order. Someone had to swab out the barrel of the cannon before the charge was inserted. You don't want to put gunpowder in a hot barrel, which could then explode before you could lose your hand trying to load the gunpowder in. And so the charge needed to be laid. So you had to put down the gunpowder, and then you rolled down what they called the ball, which is a cannonball. And the heavy gun then had to be run back into firing position, at which point the gun was aimed and the fuse was lit. And after that, you get this massive recoil. And this, by the way, you can see the very advanced surgery they had. In the middle of the decks, they had a whole lot of what looks like hardware store equipment on a normal dining room table. And that was where some poor guys would have their arms amputated and things like that. This was where the surgeon operated, on the gunnery decks. On the 21st of October, Admiral Nelson had 27 ships of the line under his command. And the French and Spanish had 33 ships of the line, including some of the largest in the world at that time. And the prevailing tactical thinking of the time required a feat to maneuver into a single line of battle where you engaged the enemy with maximum firepower so that you could give broadsides in parallel lines. So like the soldiers marching onto the field, you could imagine like Rondewash Common, you get a whole line of soldiers on one side, a whole line of soldiers on the other side, and then they shoot at one another. And that would require tremendous discipline and courage. And the side that's got the most courage and discipline and can fire the fastest will win. And it's similar when it comes to the sea. You'd line up these battleships and then they'd give broadsides on one another. And of course, if you could stand the bombardment from the others and shoot more accurately, then you could win. Otherwise, you'd get ripped to pieces. And the line of battle system facilitated control of the fleet through flag signals. You could control your men because they're all in a line. And that's one reason why, for many centuries, armies fought in line so that they could control them and move them, control where they're going and all the rest of it, and communicate. However, Lord Nelson innovated a very risky and aggressive maneuver of sailing directly for the battle line, attacking head-on to break the Franco-Spanish fleets in their line of battle and rake broadside fire at their bows, to which they'd be unable to respond. So the way these ships are built, you can see they don't have a way of firing in front, they don't have a way of firing in the back, they can only fire from the sides. And so the whole goal was to line up. Now, if you're going to charge for the enemy, you would have to go without being able to respond while they're firing at you, and only when you reach your line and break the line can you fire sideways at both sides. That's very bold. In the South African infantry, we were trained somewhat similarly. So if you got into an ambush, you were trained to turn towards the ambush, action left, action right, as the case may be. You turn to it, and then you attack. And it was fire and movement. Every second person dropped to their knees or to lie flat, prone, depending on the amount of fire at the enemy. And then the other group would go forward. They would drop, start firing. Then the second line would get up and start running forward. So you'd have constant fire and movement on the enemy. And it could take seconds. They're firing at you, action left, everyone turns left, they charge for the enemy, firing or running in turns, so that you're just moving over the enemy. And when people are firing at you, you tend to keep your head down. So the goal was, in an ambush, you put so much ferocious fire on the enemy, and you keep moving and firing until you're over them, through them. And once you're through them, they're finished. And that's what you call flanking the enemy. If you can get the enemy from the side, you can rake, and if you miss one, you get the one behind. And so you can't miss when you are flanking the enemy. And so this is an attempt to do a flanking maneuver with ships, but very dangerous. And remember, the sailing ships can't move as fast as you can run on the ground. So this was very risky. And so Nelson had his ships make all available sail. In other words, total sail to move at the fastest they possibly can to minimize the amount of time they're going to be under the fire of the enemy. In preparation for the battle, Nelson ordered the ships of his fleet to be painted in a distinctively yellow and black pattern, what they call the Nelson checker. And this was to distinguish them from their opponents to avoid friendly fire. The Germans did that with their tanks in the battle, the Blitzkrieg in Poland, and the Americans and British did that to the aircraft in the D-Day landings of Normandy. They painted distinctive stripes in order to make it harder to do friendly fire. Friendly fire is a misnomer. It's not very friendly. It's never nice to be shot, but it's even worse to be shot by your own side. So the British had this Nelson checker, yellow and black pattern painted on the side, so that you could plainly see in the din and the chaos of battle, that's one of our ships, don't aim at them and so on. And they needed that because Nelson was aware that the French and the Spanish gunners were ill-trained and supplemented with land soldiers, landlubbers, I think the British call them, who would have found it difficult to fire accurately from a moving platform on a rolling sea. Now, you can imagine, it's hard enough to fire if you have been running and you're breathing in it, and with every breath your rifle's moving up and down. And so you taught an army to, when you've got the target, hold your breath. until you've pulled the trigger. Then you can start breathing again. And so breath control is part of the fact that your rifle's moving if you've been running a lot and you're heavy breathing. Now, how much worse is that? You can imagine how easily you can miss just from running, heavy breathing, and your breathing is moving your hands and your movement. Now imagine the rolling seas. You've got to plan when exactly you fire your cannon. And these landlubbers wouldn't have had any practice at it, and they were probably hopeless shots. The ships were rolling heavily across the swells, so Nelson's plan was a very serious risk, but a carefully calculated one. He wanted to smash their fleets. I mean, they massed on the one side, and he's coming in with two fire and movement plans. They're going to come in two columns, and of course, the forward ship's going to take most of the damage because they are right in front, and the other ones are immediately behind. We do that also in infantry, where you might come up and each one's behind another one, and he empties his weapon, and next one line takes it, and then next behind it, and you're all sharing the space. So you're not spread out so that you can all be easily shot, but you're concentrating so that each one is covering for the one behind them. And so in this battle, the leading ships, and who was the lead ship? Lord Nelson's. The Victory was right in front. So Admiral Nelson had prepared his men for this risky, aggressive maneuver of charging for the enemy line in two columns with the intention of punching through their line of battle and achieving local superiority and doubling up on enemy ships. Doubling up means in most battles, you could only fire one side of your cannons at any one time because the other side was facing away from the enemy. But once you got in amongst them, you could fire both directions, engaging more of your guns. And again, if you miss the one ship, you're going to get the ship behind him because you flanked them in the middle and you're able to double up. You can maximize all your firepower because you're in amongst the enemy. But that's super aggressive and super dangerous. Victory would go to the side that could reload and shoot the fastest, and who could shoot the most accurately. And Nelson believed it was the British sailors who could achieve this. And certainly they were the most advanced sailors the world had ever seen, and no navy could fire as rapidly or as accurately as the Royal Navy at that time. He instructed his captains to be free from hampering rules, to take initiative during the inevitable confusion caused by the pell-mell battle. Once you get amongst the enemy, it's going to be like chaos. And they would, and the night just speak about a melee where everyone's doing their own thing. Now, Nelson coached all his men, you must take initiative. You've heard the saying, no plan survives contact with the enemy. You can have whatever plan you like, but the moment you encounter the enemy, he's going to have a counterattack, and he's going to react in unexpected and unpredictable ways too. So you may have your plans, but you don't know what's going to happen after the first shots are fired. After that, they say, after you engage the enemy, every plan goes to hell. He encouraged initiative by every ship's captain. No captain can do very wrong if he places a ship alongside that of the enemy. So basically, you get yourself into a position where you can empty your guns into the enemy, take all the initiative you need to do that. So circumstances would dictate the execution of their plans. It depends how the enemy is going to react. The guiding rule was the enemy's rear was to be cut off. Superior force concentrated in the enemy's line of escape. The goal wasn't just to shoot a few French ships, it was to destroy them. So he had to get through, but once he got through, they had to block them and prevent them from escaping. Early in the morning of the 21st of October, Nelson's fleet found the combined French and Spanish fleets in a long line headed for the Straits of Gibraltar, trying to go into the Mediterranean where they thought they could be safer in southern France. And you can see there's Cape Trafalgar is close to the Straits of Gibraltar. And as the fight was not far from Gibraltar, that's what they called the battle. At 8:40 in the morning, the French-Spanish fleet reversed course to offer battle. And I think, again, this Admiral Villeneuve wanted to redeem his honor. He'd been hiding in port for so long, and Napoleon, the emperor, was about to fire him. So he felt he should turn and fight, which was an honorable thing to do, but not very wise with hindsight. As French Admiral Villeneuve ordered his fleet to wear together to rearrange their lines so that they're not all sailing in one direction, but they are in a defensive posture to present broadsides on the British. To confront the Royal Navy, Admiral Nelson hosted a series of signals, including the classic, England expects every man to do his duty. And this is the pattern of of Serampore. You've heard of Serampores. So Serampores are different naval flags, and they all have different meanings on their own. But if you put them together, they are alphabetical as well, A, B, C, D, all the way along. Interesting, if you go to the waterfront in the Cape, you normally pass by a whole lot of Serampore flags at the entrance. But the people don't seem to understand very well, because you see things like, the plague is here, we have smallpox. I mean, they've got all sorts of flags at the entrance. And then they put some national flags amongst it. You never mix national flags with Serampore signal flags. So I think somebody needs to teach the waterfront about some naval etiquette and flag etiquette, because they are telling people all sorts of things. You shouldn't go into the waterfront, because they normally have a couple of flags up saying we have the plague and we have smallpox and so on. So anyway, aside from that, the crews on the Royal Navy ships had to endure enemy broadsides for 40 minutes. To be under fire for 40 minutes before you can even fire one of your cannon, that takes discipline. That's serious discipline. And in infantry, when we had to charge at the enemy while the enemy is firing at us, that takes discipline too. One particular time, up in Angola during Operation Smoke Shell 1980, the 6th South African Infantry came under serious attack. Talking about thousands of Cubans and FAPLA, Angolan Communist forces, opened fire with artillery, rockets, heavy fire on a line of South African buffels. Now, these are open-topped armored cars. You've got armor on the side, and massive fire. You've got no real protection from above. It's only really protection from landmines, these buffels. And nobody heard the order, but maybe it was just all known, this is what we do. Every one of the vehicles on the road turned and raced towards the cliff. Now, part of the goal, and this works better when you're in vehicles, which can go a lot faster than sail ships, the faster you go forward towards the guns, towards the enemy, the more their fire is falling over your heads to the back. You're going under the guns, so to speak. They can't change the elevation quick enough as you go racing under. We raced towards the enemy. There's no real orders, and then suddenly, at the base of the cliff, the order went down flaps. You pull the bolt, and the side of the buffel armor flies down. It doesn't make sense. You're under fire, and you've got to drop the metal, which then charge. Release bolts, drop flaps, charge. And that's, again, the fire and movements. And most people just went to ground and started to build trenches with their elbows. Yes, being under fire is very intense. But that's South African Army tactics. You charge for the enemy, and then you charge him. You try and go under his guns so fast. But it's one thing when you've got a vehicle. It's another thing when you're on a sail ship. They had to endure 40 minutes of bombardment. Yet they succeeded in cutting the line and raking the French and Spanish vessels with devastating broadsides. Just before 12 noon, the two fleets came within range, and HMS Victory, leading the first column, became involved in desperate fight with 4 enemy ships. And Admiral Collingwood's flagship, the HMS Royal Sovereign, commanded the downward or lee column, engaged the Spanish contingent of the command fleet, while Nelson's Victory was engaging the French section. At 11:50, HMS Victory hoisted the signal, engaged the enemy more closely, as the first shot of the battle was fired. And they plunged into the enemy. I mean, this was probably about the bravest thing you could do in the Navy. By noon, Victory was engaged with no less than 4 enemy vessels, including the most powerful warship in the world. The Spanish 136-gun first-rate Santa Cima Trinidad, along with Heros Redoutable and the French flagship Bucentaure. And despite serious damage, Victory passed under the stern of Bucentaure, fired a devastating broadside down the length of the French flagship. And Redoutable carried a force of Marines, a large force of Marines, and one of the French sharpshooters hit Admiral Nelson, the bullet lodging in his spine. As Captain Jean-Jacques Lucas was preparing his crew to board the Victory, they were disrupted by the second British ship in line, the 98-gun Temera, and firing into the crew assembled on the Redoutable's deck, they probably wiped out hundreds of people in the first broadside. Under fire from both Victory and Temeraire, Redoubtable fought on until a crew sustained 90% casualties, most of them fatal. He couldn't imagine the noise. I know my father had hearing damage after being in the Royal Artillery for all 6 years, Second World War in itself. And pardon, sorry, say again. And anyone who's been in artillery has some serious hearing deficits. And here you can see a rough deployment of these ships and then the chaos of battle. The center and the rear of the French and Spanish line were subjected to savage close engagements, where the British used their superior gunnery to batter the French and the Spanish ships, causing massive casualties and silencing their guns. Men on both sides fought with tremendous courage amidst indescribable carnage. When you've got cannons firing into wooden ships, it's not just metal flying around, it's splinters of wood flying all over the place, and then you've got some of the wooden masts collapsing, and people are under incredible fire. There's the Marines shooting rifles, there's the cannons ripping through, there's tackle and sails falling down, there's flying splints of wood everywhere. It's incredible. And so as Victory crossed the line, became entangled with the Redoubtable. And French infantry poured fire onto decks of Victory. At 1:15 p.m., a musket ball struck Admiral Nelson, who was standing in full view on the quarterdeck overseeing the battle, which is just what you would expect of a man like that. He was in the thick of it, in the first line. Victory was saved from being taken by the arrival of a 98-gun Temeraire, which hit Redoubtable with a broadside that killed and wounded 200 Frenchmen, amassing for attack on their main deck. Temeraire ploughed into Redoubtable and disabled the Foreux with a broadside from its disengaged side. That's doubling up. 5-2, Redoubtable finally struck her colours and brought down their flag to indicate surrender. This permitted Victory and Temeraire to double up on Bucentaure, and the Britannia is here seen firing into the French Bucentaure, which had been crippled by Victory. By the end of the battle at 4:15, the Bucentaure surrendered to HMS Conqueror, and the French and the Spanish combined fleets had lost 22 ships, and the British had lost no ships. Although many Royal Navy ships were severely damaged, as you could imagine, but they hadn't lost one. But before Lord Nelson died, 3 hours later, he had been informed his final battle had been a triumphant success. More than half the enemy fleet was captured or destroyed. Not one British ship had been lost. And the Royal Sovereign is depicted here alongside the Spanish ship Santa Ana, Nelson's victory of 1805, 220 years ago. Among Lord Nelson's final words were, "Now I'm satisfied. Thank God I've done my duty." His last recorded words were, "God and my country." As the sea battle took place about 20 miles to the northwest of Cape Trafalgar, the battle was named Trafalgar, and the French and Spanish casualties exceeded 13,000 in this battle. France had lost 10 ships, destroyed or captured, over 2,000 dead, more than 1,000 wounded, 4,000 captured. The Spanish had lost 10 ships, captured, over 1,000 dead, over 1,000 wounded, 4,000 captured. The French and Spanish casualties were 10 times higher than those of the British, even though the British had endured 40 minutes of fire before they could even reply. Obviously, they weren't as good shots. Although the first British ships to engage took severe punishment, not a single Royal Navy vessel had been lost. And you can just imagine the scenes of the carnage and the rescue efforts and people hanging to bits of broken masts and so on in the sea. Nelson's overwhelming triumph over the combined Franco-Spanish fleet ensured Britain's protection from invasion for the remainder of the Napoleonic Wars. And Vice Admiral Villeneuve was taken prisoner aboard his flagship, and he was brought to Britain, and Villeneuve even attended Nelson's funeral while in Britain in St. Paul's. He was then paroled. Again, the war wasn't over, but there was this chivalry and graciousness. He was allowed to return to France, but he was murdered en route to Paris with 6 stab wounds, and the official French report was he had committed suicide. You know, how many people do you know commit suicide by stabbing themselves 6 times? But obviously we had suiciding and arkanciding back then too, where people are suicided for them. So governments have been lying for a very long time and attributing murders to suicide. Although Napoleon ordered an ambitious naval expansion program to try and repair the damage and replace the lost ships, France was never again able to effectively challenge Britain at sea. And I'm sure there wouldn't be too many seamen willing to do it either. Following the Battle of Trafalgar, the Royal Navy was never again seriously challenged by the French or the Spanish fleets. And Lord Nelson became, and he remains, Britain's greatest naval war hero. He is the inspiration for the Royal Navy. And the famous Trafalgar Square was named in honor of Nelson's victory. And by the way, can you see South Africa House? We've got like the premier spot on Trafalgar Square. I've been here many a time. The South African Embassy, South Africa House, is right on Trafalgar Square, which is the biggest open space you get in downtown London. And Trafalgar Square named in honor of Nelson's victory, of course, and the statue of Nelson's column, finished in 1843, towers triumphantly over it. This daring, unconventional tactic employed by Nelson ensured a strategically decisive victory. And here you've got a famous Battle of Trafalgar picture that actually combines 4 different events from the battle. You see Nelson's famous signal, England expects every man to do his duty, flying from the victory. You can see the Achille on fire in the background, which was late afternoon. The Redoubtable sinking in the foreground, which actually happened the following day, but it's a great composite picture. And it's a tribute to Nelson's delegating style of leadership that the battle continued to a successful conclusion, even after his critical injury. I mean, that's the thing. You may do well, but how well will your men do if you're taken out of the picture? And so great leadership is to ensure that the men can operate actually without you. Lord Nelson was and is still highly respected as the model of duty and of devotion to your country. And all in England, I mean, he's got the premier spot in Britain, and a magnificent tomb also in St. Paul's Cathedral, which I've seen, which also has General Charles Gordon in the opposite chapel just facing in St. Paul's, who was once Commandant General of the Cape and was also the governor of Sudan, South Sudan. And so you can see that victory was put in newspaper and posters, Britannia triumphant, the most decisive and glorious naval victory that ever was obtained since the creation of the world. The victorious British fleet was commanded by the most renowned, most gallant, and ever to be lamented hero, Admiral Lord Viscount Nelson. And then they've got the list of the French and Spanish ships that were either captured or sunk on that day. Combined fleets superior in guns. They had 474 more guns and had over 8,000 more men. So this is basically being documented at that time. Notice the British line as part of Britannia, this victorious battle woman with the British shield, which you're not meant to use anymore, apparently. The news of the death of Lord Nelson at the battle produced an outpouring of grief, and King George III declared, "We have lost more than we have gained. We do not know whether we should mourn or rejoice. The country has gained the most splendid and decisive victory, but it has been dearly purchased." Notice at this lying in state, they not only have the naval flags, but they've got the royal standards as well. HMS Victory, bearing the body of Nelson, towed into Gibraltar after the Battle of Trafalgar. The Victory ship actually had to be towed. It was in such bad state. The funeral procession for Lord Nelson to St. Paul's Cathedral in London was a vast state occasion. I don't think they've ever seen anything like it on the Thames. You could certainly say the greatest naval funeral service in history. And all the flags in England at half-mast. The funeral procession consists of 32 admirals, 100 captains, an escort of 10,000 soldiers from the Admiralty to St. Paul's Cathedral. I don't think they've ever seen anything like this. And certainly the most famous funeral at St. Paul's ever. St. Paul's, by the way, is at the highest point in London. I've walked up there and I've felt for those people who, for example, had to carry Lady Thatcher's coffin up that hill. It's a steep hill. And these coffins for state events are lead-lined. They're very heavy, extremely heavy. The service lasted 4 hours. And notice in St. Paul's, they had the main battlefield flags of the Spanish Navy and the French Navy, and the French one looks pretty tattered. But what a great venue. The warmth, the courage, the generosity, and the spirit of Admiral Nelson won the affection and loyalty of his officers and his men, and the admiration of the Empire. Now, at this point, his right eye was already blind, but he didn't always wear a patch because it didn't. The eye was sightless, but it didn't look ghastly, so he didn't have to wear a patch. Greater love has no one than this, than to lay down your life for his friends. So John 15 gives the highest sacrifice anyone can make is to give his life. And that is what soldiers and sailors are expected to do. And Nelson summarizes the Navy and the nation. And naval warfare in the age of sail, all of these naval textbooks have the Battle of Trafalgar on the cover. It is the decisive battle. In the British Army, when you speak about the battle, they will be talking about Waterloo. In the Royal Navy, if they talk about the battle, they talk about Trafalgar. And in Gibraltar town, which is the closest British possession to where the event took place, they've got a monument to him. Gibraltar also has their one crown, has Lord Nelson on the one side and the Queen on the other. Gibraltar has stamps that they bring out, such as on the anniversary of the death of Nelson. That's a young Nelson there. The Cayman Islands as well, which is a real tax haven for many rich people. Interestingly, bizarrely, the musket ball that killed Lord Nelson was made into a pendant locket presented to Queen Victoria. Now, I heard that the cross that Charlie Kirk was wearing when he was assassinated has been made into some ornament as well, which also seems very strange to me. But this is what was done at the time. And of course, many memorials, many medals bear his image and his hat, which has obviously seen better days. And here is where Lord Nelson married Frances Nisbet, and quite extraordinary what she put up with. She had hoped that he, after he was wounded, would never go out and risk his life again. She wasn't really made to be a Navy officer's wife because she never expected to lose her husband in battle. Fanny Nisbet. There's also a film with Peter Finch and Glenda Jackson on Bequest the Nation, which has got probably the best film depiction of the Battle of Trafalgar. And it's about the extraordinary relationship he had with the British ambassador's wife, who was something of a mother figure when he was brought to Naples, and Naples was a separate country. Italy wasn't unified yet. And Lady Hamilton basically was a motherly figure that nursed him when he was at his worst, when he'd lost his arm and he'd lost his eye, and he was a shattered, broken man. And that's a complicated part of his past and an interesting aspect there. In Cape Town, we have the most prestigious hotel in town is the Lord Nelson, or the Mount Nelson Hotel. Now, look at those gates. It's a great place to go, by the way, for English tea. If you want a real traditional English tea, and I've taken my family there, it's the way it should be. And this hotel dates back to the 1700s, long before Admiral Nelson. But because he did stop in at the Cape, and he did stay here, they named the hotel after him. And I think a lot of people thought the Mount Nelson was named after the Nelson Mandela, but no. No, it long predates him. Okay, you saw a picture of the entrance. Quick observation test. How many pillars are there at the Mount Nelson entrance gate? Column. Well, you got a number? 4. Okay. Any better estimate? Sorry? I think it's 28, that's correct. So, have a better look, not 4. 28 pillars. It's an observation test when you go past, because I've been past them many times, but so that's Cape Town's tribute to Nelson. Obviously, we have our On the Frontline YouTube channel on the frontlinemissionsa.org website, where we'll put presentations from the Reformation Society and any of our seminars, like the Kruger 200 that we had last week, are on there, so you can share it with anyone else you may want to. Remember, we've got newsletters online and lectures like on the French Revolution, which is the important background to this. There's so much we need to understand of history, but if you go onto our sermon audio or on the Frontline YouTube channel, you'll find many of these presentations from previous Reformation Society presentations. We've got the reformationsa.org website. By the way, I thought you'd like to see a picture of Owen Powell's statue arriving in Oranje, unveiled. This is the replica, like the one in Church Street in Pretoria, but now it's in Oranje where there's no danger of being vandalized.